Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us on our webinar for resource management. My name is James, and I'm going to be presenting the slides for you today. So it should take us about 10-15 minutes to go through the slides, and then we've got time for any questions at the end. If we don't have time to answer your questions during the session, then we'll send out an email afterwards with the questions and all the answers on there from the session. So during the session, we're going to be looking at identifying any issues. So we're looking specifically for bottlenecks or problem times when you don't answer the calls that are coming into the practice. We'll be looking at group management and how that can help you manage those queues. Auto step in, which is one of the functions that we have available within Surgery Connect. And we'll do a brief introduction to reports. So identifying your bottlenecks and when the calls aren't being answered can be done in two different ways. You can either look at it as a real-time analysis and enter through the user console. On the user console, obviously, you're going to have all your calls showing on the left-hand side. And if you can see a lot of queued calls, so those calls will be in red on the screen, then we know that we've got calls that aren't being answered straight away. The statistics at the bottom of the screen will show you how long your longest patient has been waiting in the queues. And you'll also see your user status changing for that particular group. So remember that if they're in dark grey, they're not logged in, so they won't be a part of that group. If they're in orange, they're in Do Not Disturb. So then no call's going to be going through to that member of staff either. And if their initials are coloured, they're already on calls. Now, if you've got red calls queuing and you've got people still available, then we need to have a look at the system, and you may need to contact our support team, because if there's calls queuing and you've got people in that queue available, then there's obviously an issue somewhere. But if everybody is on calls, then obviously it will show with the colours on their initials so that you know that they're already busy. Alternatively, we could look at the reports. So the reports are accessed through the single sign-on. So when you sign in, one of the boxes will be the reports, or you can use the web address that shows on the screen there to get directly into the reports console. We also send out a monthly email, and within that email, it will have a management report for your particular practice, which will give you a summary of how many calls you've taken during that month and how many have been answered, as well as how many have been missed. So you'll have your missed percentages on there as well for the month. That will also break it down into which groups took the most calls and give you a lot of management information within that email. So if you're not receiving that email and you would like to, if you want to email training@exon.co.uk, we can add you onto our distribution list and make sure that you're receiving that email each month. The reports through the reports console can be accessed at any time, and we'll have a look at that later on in the session. So your group management will allow your staff to step into or out of different groups. So there are 3 different permission levels within Surgery Connect. Your standard users have a restricted user console view. So they won't see the internal contact list. They'll have the central directory, which will include the internal and external numbers for the practice. Now, if we've got standard users, it would need to be a supervisor that would then step them in and out of those groups. So if you've got people who are set up as standard users, they don't have access to do that themselves, but the supervisors can step them in and out of groups. Standard users also have no access to their call recordings. If we use a standard user with group management as your permission levels, that will give them the full user console. So they'll also be able to see the internal user list as well as the central directory, and they can step in and out of groups. So this is ideal for any team leaders that you have that wouldn't normally take calls within the group, but if it gets busy, they can opt to go straight into the group and start taking calls straight away. Standard users with group management can also access their own call recordings, but they can only replay those call recordings, so they can't download them and they can't delete them. The final permission level is supervisor. So they would have full user console access. You can step in and out of groups for yourself, and you can also do that for other people. So if you've got standard users on the system, then the supervisors would be able to step them in and out of those groups. and you can access all the practice call recordings, and you can replay, download, or delete those. If you need to change your permission levels, they can be changed through the user option in the service delivery console, or if your practice is on the configuration console, then if you contact our support team, they can change those user permission levels for you. Once those permission levels have been granted, group management is then accessed through the individual's user console. So if you log onto the user console and click on your initials at the top right-hand corner, as well as the devices to send your calls to in your status, you also have the groups that you're a member of and take calls for. So we can see on the screen here that I'm a member of both appointments and physiotherapy. Now, if I only took appointments calls when that queue was really busy, because I'm a standard user with group management, I can untick that box, which will then take me out of that appointments group. So if the group's not busy, I can be removed from the group temporarily. And then if the call queue starts building again, and I can see that on my user console, I can click back onto my appointments, which will then add me back into that group so that I'm then part of that incoming calling group and can start taking calls again. So that would be standard user with group management. Now, your group management, if you were managing a standard user and you were the supervisor, would work exactly the same. So you would click on their name within the user groups, and then you can tick the group management that you want them in or out of. They will need to be part of the group in your setup, so either through the service delivery console or in the configuration console. They'll need to be members of those groups, but then they can tick to deactivate that as they need to. Or we can get the system to do this automatically. So we can use auto step in. So parameters can then be set automatically to add people to groups when your queues become too long. And you can decide those parameters depending on your particular practice. So you would access that through the configuration console. So when you go to your single sign-on, you're looking for the configuration console, or you can use the web address that's shown on the screen here. When you access the configuration console, you'll have your menu down the left-hand side, and you're looking for the group option on that menu. That will then take you into an overview page where you'll have all your groups listed, and you can search those groups if you've got a lot of groups for your particular practice. When you found the group that you want, so I'm going to use the appointments group here, I can just click on the little pen down at the bottom to edit that group. And when I click on the pen, it will then take me into the editing for that particular group. Across the top of the screen, I've got some tabs, and I'm looking for the members tab so that I can set up the auto step in for that particular group. When I click on members, it will then give me a list of all the users for the practice and show me if I've already got anybody stepping in to a particular group. So this is for the appointments group, and I've already got Clara that steps in when our queue length gets to 10 people. So the queue length and queue weight, you can use either independently. If you leave them with a 0 in, it will ignore that box, but you could set it so that if you have more than 10 people in the queue, then that person would then be brought in to start answering calls, and then when it drops below 10 in the queue, they will stop receiving calls. Okay. Same thing with your seconds. So if you've got patients in the queue, so this one in particular is if they've been waiting for more than 2 minutes, then Clara will automatically start receiving calls. Because we've got both in here, it's going to look for both parameters. So there would have to be 10 people in the queue, and somebody would have had to have been waiting for more than 2 minutes before Clara will step in here. To step in anybody else, then you use the list from underneath. They don't need to be a member before you start them in the group on here, because it will add them as a member automatically when you click them to step into that particular group. So on our appointments, if I were to click on auto step in here, I would be selecting a particular user. So I'm going to add Ian Chesterton to step in on our group here. So when I've clicked on the green arrow on Ian's name, although he wasn't part of this group, he's going to be now. So he's now being made a member of this group, and I can now set the parameters when Ian is going to start taking calls. So I can set the parameters individually for each user. So if you've got people that you want to come in earlier, then you can set those parameters lower. than you do for others. That would mean that Ian would then come in first, and then if it still carried on queuing and it got to the point where Clara was needed, she would then be brought in as well. So the auto step in will then bring them in automatically. You can also look for any problems that you've got through the reports. So there's a suite of reports available within the reports console. Again, that's accessed through your single sign-on, or you can use the web address on the screen here, and that will then take you into the reporting page. There is some terminology that I just want to go through. You can see it on this management report here that we've got answered, abandoned, and missed. So an answered call, obviously, is a patient that's rung, they've gone through your queuing system and they've actually got through to a staff member and were answered on the call. Abandoned calls, though, are when a caller ended the call before they joined a queue. So they'll have rung the practice, heard the practice name, before they got through to any queues or the system's had chance to place them in a queue, they then put the phone down. So an abandoned call, there's not a lot you can do about it. It's quite often just patients ringing the wrong number or ringing back the number that they've just dialed. But missed calls are calls that have joined a queue or were targeted a user, so it was going to be put through to someone, but then wasn't answered. So a missed call we can have a look at, and you can see whether they are dropping out from the queue or whether they're actually, when they get through to a user, whether that call was then being rejected. So when you click onto the reports, it will then take you into the report console, and you'll see all the available reports down the right-hand side. You may need to expand these just by clicking on the little arrow so that you can see all the reports there. So reports can be run at any time. Once you're up and running, obviously you'll start getting data through on those reports. And if you find a report that you like particularly, then if you use the little star just next to that report, it will then save it in your favorites at the top of the page. So you'll see I've got a couple of favorites saved here. And that means then that I haven't got to go through each report each time I want to run that report. I can just click on it in my favorites and it will be a report that will show me what I need to see. So we've got an example of a couple of reports here. So this is the group overview report. So this will show you the calls coming into each group that you've then got set up on Surgery Connect. So I've generated a report on the training database from the 17th to the 23rd of February here. The dates were preset, but I can select those through the calendar and then just click Generate Report when I'm ready. So it then gives me a graph to show me my different groups and what percentage of my inbound call went through to those different groups. That information is also duplicated in a table format so that you can then see what's happening with those groups. And you can export these reports to Excel. So if you need to include them into management reports, then you can do that from here as well. So we can see the different groups here, and then we've got the columns. So we've got how many people queued for that particular group and how many were then answered. You've then got your percentages that were answered from that particular queue. So we can see that appointments answered 100% of their calls, but prescriptions only managed to answer a third of their calls, and 2/3 of them were actually missed. So that would be highlighting that actually we need to look at the staffing levels that we've got in that prescription group, and then maybe add some extra people in there. Same with our admin and insurance queries. They've missed 100% of their calls, so we would expect to be seeing somebody added into those groups to make sure that those calls were added. The next report that I've got is again a group report, but this time it shows it hourly. So the hourly report will show you any bottlenecks that you have during the day. So we can see from the graph here that we've got a couple of points during the day where call levels are particularly high. And when you look at the missed, you can see that the missed also is quite high there in those points. If we look at that in a tabular format, you can go down where the calls were answered and actually see where your bottlenecks are. So we can see here that we've got between 9 and 10, 2/3 of the calls have been missed. So we're definitely going to need to find some extra staff to answer calls between 9 and 10, and also between 1 and 3, because we also have a high number of calls that are being missed at that period. So once you've ascertained that from the reports, then it would be deciding whether you want to do that via changing user levels and giving the staff the empowerment to look at the call levels and see that they're high and step in automatically, or whether that's something that you're going to be doing and then stepping them into groups as and when you need extra people to answer the calls. I hope that's been useful for you. So we've had a look at identifying the issues either real time or through the reports. We've also looked at group management and the different levels there, and whether you want to do that on an individual basis so that they can step themselves in and out, or whether you want to use auto step in so that the system will bring them in as and when needed. And then a very brief introduction to reports, but we will cover more reports in the next session on our webinar. Does anybody have any questions about anything that we've covered in this session? If you'd like to put your questions on the chat on the meeting for me, and then I can answer any questions that we have now. And then if we don't have any questions, anything that comes up afterwards, we'll send out via email. So I'll just give you a moment just to ask any questions that you may have there. Does the report by group work once the caller is in a queue, or is it taken from the menu press? So it'll be when they join your queue. Other than that, if they haven't actually got to the queue, if they abandon before that, then it'll be an abandoned call rather than a missed call that's actually gone into your queues.